Luciferian elite of this world remain in the shadows as they manipulate world events to bring about the wars they want. They have also deceived white Americans into serving their diabolical purposes by creating an illusion of white supremacy. America is now at the point of no return, facing the wrath of the Most High for the crimes committed against his people. Why? Because they refuse to hear the truth, see the truth, or allow others to speak the truth regarding the crimes committed against the descendants of the children of Israel. A little known truth is that the elite created white supremacy as a strategy to divide and conquer. It was also used by slaveholders to maintain control over those they had enslaved. They also had the help of religious leaders. Slavery lasted for centuries because theologians used the Bible to justify it in order to soothe the conscience of white Christians and mask their guilt. They duped them into believing that Europeans had actually helped the savage Negroes by rescuing them from the jungles of Africa and showing them how to be civilized. The lies did not stop there. They also taught Negroes a whitewashed version of Christianity. The underlying message was how to endure slavery and be a good Christian when God is white and you're black. In this session, we will talk about how the hidden hand of the elite is still working behind the scenes to bring about the war they want. Let's begin with how it all started. I'll read some excerpts from this article entitled Inventing Black and White. It's talking about what happened in Virginia in the 1600s, how a man named Anthony Johnson and a woman named Elizabeth Key successfully appealed to the colony's legal system to get their freedom because they had been wrongfully enslaved. It says by the 1700s, the laws and customs of Virginia had begun to distinguish black people from white people, making it impossible for Virginians of African descent to do what Johnson and Key had done. So something happened to change that. It was called Bacon's Rebellion. Let's go on. Historians considered the Virginia Rebellion, also known as Bacon's Rebellion, to be the first stirring of revolutionary ideas in America. I also want to pull in some information from this article about law and the structure of power in colonial Virginia to find out more about this. It says, a potentially transforming event occurred, talking about Bacon's Rebellion, when Nathaniel Bacon, a newcomer from England who had settled on the Virginia frontier, led a rebellion that resulted in a civil war that nearly toppled the colonial regime. Ultimately, Bacon's rebellion was suppressed, and its suppression resulted not in change, but in reinforcement of legal developments that were already occurring. Continuing on, it says, in the aftermath of rebellion, Virginia's governing elite solidified its power. These are the ruling elite. So when patriots say we're taking our country back, it tells you that they are clueless about who actually owns it. All right, let's go on. It says, after the 1670s, whites tended to immigrate to those other colonies, and Virginia was forced to replace its white indentured servants, which means they were paid, for all who keep saying that they were slaves too. They replaced them with black African slaves who became victims of severe forms of repression that never could have been imposed on voluntary immigrants from Europe. That sentence right there reveals intent. The intent was to choose to ignore laws that govern humanity. Basically, they were saying we are going to reduce these enslaved people to something less than the Creator intended. Now, for those who say there's nothing wrong with slavery because slavery's in the Bible, let me show you the difference. Let's read this from Deuteronomy 15:12 through 18. It says, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you send him away free from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. You shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. From what the Lord your God has blessed you with, you shall give to him. Did that happen to those they had enslaved? No. It goes on to say, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. And if it happens that he says to you, I will not go away from you, because he loves you and your house, since he prospers with you. He prospers with you. That means he had to have been receiving wages. Then you shall take an awl and thrust it through his ear to the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Also, to your female servant you shall do likewise. It shall not seem hard to you when you send him away free from you, for he has been worth a double hired servant in serving you 6 years. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. So the slave owners, their manner of dealing with the white indentured servants is closer to the way the servants are dealt with in Scripture. In addition, the white servants were not forced to serve for life. There was to be an end date for their service. And if, as it says here in Scripture, if they choose to remain with the master, they could. So the white slave owners made a distinction, as we just read in the previous passage, concerning persons based on color. They said they would never have been able to get away with treating the white indentured servants the way they entreated the enslaved Negroes. So this form of slavery used by Europeans was criminal, and it was intentionally wicked, and for that they will be judged. Another example is given in Ephesians 6. We'll look at 5 through 9. It says bondservants, and that word should be servants. Be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. And you masters do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So this is telling us that those who serve are to be treated with respect. It's telling us you are not to mistreat them. You're not to be harsh with them, because it's reminding the masters that you also have a master who's not impartial, which means he's not influenced by physical appearance or skills or your success in life. He's looking at your heart. He's looking at the way you serve. So again, the European slave owners dealt differently with the white indentured servants, and it was all based on a color. So huge difference here. Now let's go back to the article talking about inventing black and white. It says, although Bacon died of fever a month later, so after the rebellion, and the rebellion fell apart, Virginia's wealthy planters were shaken by the fact that a rebel militia had united white and black servants and slaves and had destroyed the colonial capital. Legal scholar Michelle Alexander writes, the events in Jamestown were alarming to the planter elite, who were deeply fearful of the multiracial alliance of indentured servants and slaves. Word of Bacon's rebellion spread far and wide, and several more uprisings of a similar type followed. In an effort, don't miss this, to protect their superior status and economic position, the planters shifted their strategy for maintaining dominance. They abandoned their heavy reliance on indentured servants in favor of the importation of more black slaves. So after Bacon's rebellion, Virginia's lawmakers began to make legal distinctions between white and black inhabitants. By permanently enslaving Virginians of African descent and giving poor white indentured servants and farmers some new rights and status. So they hoped to separate the two groups and make it less likely that they would unite again in rebellion. Let's keep going. It says, soon after Bacon's rebellion, they increasingly distinguish between people of African descent and people of European descent. They enact laws which say that people of African descent are hereditary slaves, and they increasingly give some power to independent white farmers and landholders. So it says, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first appearance in print of the adjective white in reference to a white man, a person of a race distinguished by a light complexion, was in 1671. Colonial charters and other official documents written in the 1600s and early 1700s rarely refer to European colonists as white. So they changed from being colonizers to white people. It says, as the status of people of African descent in the British colonies was challenged and attacked, and as white indentured servants were given new rights and status, the word white continued to be more widely used in public documents and private papers to describe the European colonists. So the elite invented a new class of people. Was it because they were a superior race? No. It was because they needed them to help them control the true money makers, those who would be forced to build the nation for free. Now let's return to the journal article, Law and the Structure of Power in Colonial Virginia, and you'll see how the covenant was made between this created class of people referred to as white and the ruling elite. It says the switch to black labor also changed the nature of the remaining white community. Most significantly, the poor white community that elites had to govern was smaller and therefore easier to control than it would have been if indentured servants had continued to provide most of Virginia's labor. Over time, the young rowdy men who had followed Nathaniel Bacon into rebellion grew older, obtained families, and became more accepting of their position in life and less willing to turn to violence and rebellion to better it. Finally, the potential for black resistance arguably threatened poor whites as well as elite ones, thereby giving the elites an argument for uniting the white underclass with them in their practices of repressing blacks. This was the trade-off right here. They made whites believe that they had something to fear from blacks. So it was in their best interest to help them to police the Negroes. This is why they pretend not to see racial injustice. The elite bought their silence. Now let's see how they used Christianity in this great deception. It says many late 17th century Virginians found Christianity an important force in creating a civilized community, a main argument for enslaving blacks, especially in the 17th and early 18th century, was that whites were Christian and thus civilized, whereas almost all blacks before the Great Awakening were not, and thus, it was said, had to be controlled by force. But look at this. It says, in fact, many whites in the 17th century had not been practicing Christians. But I found something interesting regarding why they needed to classify us as heathens and pagans. I want to share this with you. Look at this next article. I believe this is a very critical piece of the puzzle. Previously, I read the papal bull created by the Roman Catholic Church that gave Portugal the permission to enslave our people in West Africa, even though they knew who we were. They knew that we were Israelites. But this will explain why they had to cover that up. They had to hide who we were because they had legal traditions that regulated how they were to treat Jews. So they had to label us as heathens and pagans. All right, so it says 15th century Iberian legal traditions regulated Christians' treatment of Jews, Muslims, and other Christians, clearly delineating, for example, who was enslavable and who was not. In contrast, the judicial status of people who did not fit these categories was more ambiguous. Legal and philosophical arguments to address this issue began to evolve during the second half of the 15th century, once Portuguese mariners began to return to Iberia with captives acquired in West Africa and West Central Africa. Notably, the treatment of black Gentiles was addressed in 1452 and 1555 when Pope Nicholas V issued a series of papal bulls that granted Portugal the right to enslave sub-Saharan Africans. It says church leaders argued that slavery served as a natural deterrent and Christianizing influence to barbarous behavior among pagans. So they labeled us as black Gentiles or pagans, knowing who we were, because they knew that their legal traditions prevented them from enslaving our people. This is just pure wickedness, you all. Let's go on. Now let's look at the underlying goal of the ruling elite, and stay with me because this information is going to help you understand how the ruling elite are still using this same system to maintain their dominance and control. It says whatever masters may have done, the law and the underlying economy did not treat slaves as humans, but as fungible property convertible into cash. The law said they were property considered no otherwise than horses or cattle. And the British merchants who lent money to Virginia planters thought of slaves as cash, equivalents to securing their debt. Slaves were mere numbers that merchants used in an impersonal marketplace established to satisfy Europe's demand for tobacco. They were never considered as people capable of developing relationships either with each other or with whites. To them, the Negroes were the cash cow, you all. They could force people to work from sun up to sundown and not pay them a dime for centuries. Who does this? Civilized people or the seed of the serpent? Let's go on. It says, whereas indentured servants could complete their terms of servitude and then live out human, if impoverished, lives, slaves could not. It says the original sin lay in snatching people from their homes, their families, their communities, and all they had created, and depositing them in a strange world from which they could never return. So what is at the root of it all? Greed, the love of money. This is a visual chart of all the world's wealth, and you can see that the United States profited nicely from ill-gotten gain. If you watched the previous video about the roots of darkness, you heard Professor French tell you exactly how the European nations became world powers. It had everything to do with slavery. But you can count on one hand the numbers of preachers willing to stand up and expose this wickedness. And now Babylon is falling. As I said, America is at the point of no return. Now look at this graph that's showing you the actual distribution of wealth in the United States. It's really showing us wealth inequality in America. You can see here that the top 1% own 40% of U.S. wealth. The bottom 80% own just 7% of America's wealth. Take a look at this next clip.
Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
One thing to keep in mind is that the wealth of the Luciferian elite, the ones pulling the strings, their wealth isn't even included in the chart that you just saw. Why? Because no one really knows how much money they have. They own the banking system. They're the ones printing the money. Let's look at this article from USA Facts. It says white people own 86% of wealth and make up 60% of the population. It says according to data from the Federal Reserve, these are the ones who own all the money. In 1990, white households owned 90.7% of household wealth in the United States, whereas black households own 3.8%. It says these numbers have changed little over the past 30 years, with white households now owning 85.5% of wealth in 2019 and black households owning 4.2%. How long would we have to work to have half of the wealth of white people, you all? So when you hear dog whistles about how minorities are always given handouts and entitlements, know that the cabal is at work to stir up the whites. They use propaganda to incite them to attack blacks so that they can, quote unquote, put them back in their place. Because in their minds, minorities should work hard and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But did they? Let's highlight some of the handouts given to whites that no one wants to talk about. This comes from California Newsreel. It talks about how the U.S. Army gave almost 270 million acres of land away under the 1830s Indian Removal Act. The recipients were overwhelmingly white. It says less known are more recent government racial preferences first enacted during the New Deal that directed wealth to white families and continue to shape life opportunities and chances. It says the landmark Social Security Act of 1935 provided a safety net for millions of workers, guaranteeing them an income after retirement. But the act specifically excluded two occupations: agricultural workers and domestic servants, who were predominantly African American, Mexican, and Asian. There was also the Wagner Act that gave special rights to whites. It gave unions the power to help white workers get better paying jobs and benefits. Also, the Federal Housing Administration made it possible for millions of white Americans to own a home for the first time. Then they used redlining to prevent blacks from getting loans. This says between 1934 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion in home loans. More than 98% went to whites. So are these entitlements and handouts? Were these incentives earned? No, it was bestowed on those with white skin. Just a little more on this. It says one result of the generations of preferential treatment for whites is that a typical white family today has on average 8 times the wealth of the net worth of a typical African American family, according to economist Edward Wolfe. So the author sums it up by saying, rather than recognize how racial preferences have tilted the playing field and given us a head start in life, many whites continue to believe that race does not affect our lives. Instead, we chastise others for not achieving what we have. We even invert the situation and accuse non-whites of using the race card to advance themselves. Take a look at this next clip. That video was called The Unequal Opportunity Race by Erica Pinto, by the way. Now, with everything I've covered thus far, the information from this article will not be surprising to you. This is from the New York Post. It says, poll finds most Americans oppose reparations for slavery. Let's read on to find out why. It says only 29% of Americans say the government should pay cash reparations. But the poll reveals a large divide between Americans of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Most Black Americans, 74%, favor reparations compared to 15% of white Americans. Among Hispanics, now why Hispanics are in this, I don't know. Do they even have a dog in this fight? Among Hispanics, 44% favor reparations. Lori Statzer, 79, of West Palm Beach, Florida, opposes cash reparations and an official government apologies. She opposed cash reparations and an official government apology. Here's what she says. None of the black people in America today are under the slavery issue, said Statzer, who is white. It's over with. Using taxpayers' money to pay reparations would be unfair to me, she added. My ancestors came to this country, worked hard to become Americans, and never asked for anything. Now, isn't that laughable considering everything that I just read? Oh, let's go on. Zion, if you sincerely believe that the Most High is just, then you know that He's going to balance the books and He's going to avenge His people. The wicked may have overlooked this scripture right here in Zechariah 2:8. For thus says the Lord of hosts, He sent me after glory to the nations which plunder you. For he who touches you touches the apple of His eye. When the Europeans had the opportunity to do the right thing, the love of money constrained them. So when the Most High balances the books, He's going to force them to pay more than they wanted to pay. And that day is coming faster than they think. The nations that plundered us will be plundered. So let me share this story with you before I bring this to a close. Last Sunday, my husband and I spent a good portion of the day just watching movies, and it was his turn to pick a movie, and he chose Pompeii. Now, we had seen it before when it first came out, but decided to watch it again. And as I'm sitting there, they're talking about General Titus, and something clicked. I started thinking, General Titus? The destruction of Jerusalem, is this the same General Titus? And if so, how long after the destruction of the temple was Pompeii destroyed? It was only 9 years later, you all. I was stunned because I had not made that connection before. So I started doing some digging. So let's listen to this. It's from Biblical Archaeology Society. It says, the destruction of Pompeii, God's revenge. This is 9 years almost to the day after Roman legionnaires destroyed God's house in Jerusalem. God destroyed the luxurious watering holes of the Roman elite. Was this God's revenge? That's not exactly the question I want to raise, however. Rather, did anyone at the time see it that way? Did anyone connect the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE with the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70? So yes, it was the same Titus. He was the general at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, but he became emperor in AD 79, the same year of the eruption. So now I'm thinking this could not have been a coincidence. So there were records of eyewitnesses, one of them being Pliny the Younger and another Dio Cassius. So Dio Cassius said the eruption consumed the temples of Serapis, Isis, Neptune, and Jupiter, among others. It was almost as if a supreme God was at work, he said. Now to me, this was a message to the Romans. It was like the Most High was saying, you dared to touch what's mine. Listen to the rest of this. It says the whole plain round about Vesuvius seethed, and the summits leaped into the air. There were frequent rumblings, some of them subterranean, that resembled thunder, and some on the surface that sounded like bellowings. The sea also joined in the roar, and the sky re-echoed it. Then suddenly a portentous crash was heard, as if the mountains were tumbling in ruins. And first huge stones were hurled aloft, rising as high as the very summits. Then came a great quantity of fire and endless smoke, so the whole atmosphere was obscured, and the sun was entirely hidden, as if eclipsed. It says, thus day was turned into night and light into darkness. Some believed that the whole universe was being resolved into chaos or fire. While this was going on, an inconceivable quantity of ashes was blown out, which covered both sea and land and filled all the air. It buried 2 entire cities, Herculaneum and Pompeii. Indeed, the amount of dust taken altogether was so great that some of it reached Africa and Syria and Egypt, and it also reached Rome, filling the air overhead and darkening the sun. And that's not all. Apparently, there were 2 disasters. This eruption that happened in AD 79, and then the fire of Rome that happened a year later. Listen to this, you all. It says Titus enjoyed a successful military career, and in 67 AD went with his father to suppress the Jewish revolt. In 69 AD, Vespasian returned to Rome to assert his claim for the imperial throne, leaving Titus to continue the campaign. In 70 AD, Jerusalem was sacked, the Jewish temple was destroyed, and much of the population killed or dispersed. So when Titus went back to Rome, he assumed his father's position in 79 AD, which was the same year of the destruction of Pompeii. That wasn't all, you all. He died of a fever in AD 81. So he only served as emperor for about 2 years. Now, to me, this was a clear message that the Most High was speaking. You have this Mount Vesuvius erupting, you have this fire in Rome, and they also had a plague going on. All of this happening when Titus, the one who was present during the destruction of Jerusalem, is serving as emperor. Surely the Romans knew that this was a sign. It was as if the Most High was saying, you dare to touch what is mine. Let me show you who I am. We are the apple of the Most High's eye, and the elite and the white supremacists may think that they can keep their knees on our necks, but there is a God in Israel. I believe there's great turmoil ahead for the world. It's a time of testing for Judah, but it's also a time for us to see the mighty works of Yah. It will elevate our faith because he fights for his people. We have to pray to have ears to hear the words of the prophets in these last days and be able to discern the false from the true. But we need to trust and obey. The Most High will protect us. We also have to continue to seek the truth and begin to walk in love toward the brethren. Our deliverance comes from on high. We can't deliver ourselves from the turmoil It comes to destroy those who are wicked. But I believe we will see the mighty acts of the Most High in these last days. I have some more to share on this topic because I want to show you how this plan of the elite to divide and conquer is playing out in real time. I believe that they're trying to instigate a race war. And I also believe the media and some of these politicians have a hand in that. But just know that these wars that they continue to stir up serve another purpose. They are distractions designed to keep people from seeing what they are really doing behind the scenes. So join me next time. Shalom, everyone.